Section 8, Part 5, John Locke and the Evolution of Property. English philosopher John Locke was a pivotal figure who was also sourced in Adam Smith's more influential Wealth of Nations. Locke not only defines the idea of property in general, he presents a subtle yet powerful contradiction in Chapter 5 entitled Property of Locke's second treatise of government published in 1689. He poses an argument with respect to the nature of property and its appropriation. He states, "The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are strictly his. So when he takes something from the state that nature has provided and left it in, he mixes his labor with it, thus joining to it something that is his own, and in that way he makes it his property." This statement, which was later associated with the labor theory of value, proposes the logic that since labor is owned by the laborer, since he owns himself, any energy expelled through his labor transfers that ownership to the product made. His philosophical disposition is essentially derived from a Christian perspective, stating God gave the world to men in common, but since he gave it to them for their benefit and for the greatest convenience of life they could get from it, he can't have meant it to always remain common and uncultivated. John Locke also derives that owners are required not to allow anything to spoil, because nothing was made by God for men to spoil or destroy. They must leave enough for others. So this appropriation of a plot of land by improving it wasn't done at the expense of any other man, because there was still enough left for others. John Locke also said, anyone can, through his own labor, come to own as much as he can use in a beneficial way before it spoils. Anything beyond this is more than his share and belongs to others. These values in simplistic form seem socially justifiable in general. However, in section 36, he reveals a unique reality which in many ways nullifies all prior arguments in his defense of private property. He states, "The one thing that blocks this is the invention of money, and men's tacit agreement to put a value on it. This made it possible, with men's consent, to have larger possessions and to have a right to them. This also has the further implication that money can buy labor, which voids the idea that he, in this case the buyer, mixes his labor with it, thus joining to it something that is his own, and in that way he makes it his property. Finally, the provision that nothing was made by God for men to spoil or destroy is nullified with the new association that money, being gold or silver at the time, simply cannot spoil. This is how money came into use, as a durable thing that men could keep without its spoiling, and that by mutual consent men would take in exchange for the truly useful but perishable supports of life. It is here where we find, at least in the medium of literary discourse, the true seed of capitalist ownership justification, where the use of money treated as an abstract commodity in and of itself, in effect as an assumed embodiment of labor, allowed an evolution of thought and practice to emerge which increasingly shifted the focus from relevant production to ownership mechanics and the pursuit of profit without limit. Section 8, Part 6, Adam Smith. Often credited as one of the most influential economic philosophers in modern history, Adam Smith reached maturity at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. He lived at a time where it could be argued that the inherent features of the capitalist mode of production were becoming ever more striking, given the introduction of concentrated, centralized production facilities and markets. In 1776, Adam Smith published his now world-famous An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Among many relevant observations, he appears to be the first to recognize the three principal categories of income: profits, rents, and wages, and how they related to the main social classes of the period: capitalists, landlords, and laborers. Adam Smith's most noted contribution to the philosophy of capitalism was his general advocation that even though individuals might act in a narrow, selfish manner on their personal behalf or on the behalf of the class or group of which they were a part, and even though conflict, both individual and class-based, seemed to be the result of these actions, there was what he called an invisible hand that secured a positive social outcome from singular, selfish, non-social intentions. He wrote, "As every individual therefore endeavors as much as he can both to employ his capital in the support of domestic industry, and so to direct that industry that its produce may be of the greatest value, every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. He generally indeed neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention, nor is it always the worst for society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it." This nearly religious ideal had a powerful effect on the post-Smith era, giving a very social vindication for the inherently self-maximizing, antisocial behavior common to capitalist psychology. Adam Smith, knowing quite well the class conflict inherent to capitalism, goes on to discuss the nature of how some men gain superiorly over the greater part of their brethren, reinforcing what was to increasingly be considered a law of nature by future theorists regarding human power and subjugation. Section 8, Part 7, Malthus and Ricardo. Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo were two well-acknowledged leading theorists of political economy in the early 19th century. They were friendly rivals by some accounts, but from the broad view of history they shared virtually the same perspective closely tied to Adam Smith's. The late Industrial Revolution in Europe and America was a period of extensive conflict between laborers and capitalist owners. Numerous revolts and strikes in response to the abhorrent abusive working conditions for not only men but also women and children were common. This gave rise to the now common labor unions, and a general battle between workers and owners has continued ever since. It was in the midst of all this that Malthus and Ricardo invariably contextualized their economic and social views, beginning with Malthus and his classic work, An Essay on the Principle of Population, which orients essentially around two assumptions. The first is that the class structure of wealthy proprietors and poor laborers would inevitably reemerge no matter what reforms were attempted. The second assumption is that if the standard of living of everyone in society were increased, the vast majority would respond by increasing the amount of children they have, and so in turn the population would outpace subsistence, and the majority would be pushed back into poverty again. This Malthusian population theory is actually very inaccurate with respect to factors pertaining to population growth based on statistical understandings today. Apart from the effect technology has played in expanding production capacity and efficiency, particularly with respect to food production, the generalization that higher standards of living increase population proportionately is not supported by regional comparisons. Poor countries statistically reproduce faster than wealthy countries. This issue appears to be a cultural, religious, and educational phenomenon, not a rigid law of nature, as Malthus had concluded. Moving on to Ricardo, he essentially accepted Malthus's population theory and conclusions regarding the nature and causes of poverty, but disagreed with certain economic theories which aren't relevant to this larger discussion at hand. But Ricardo also discussed mechanization, or machine application, which systemically reduced the need for human labor in applied sectors. He alluded to the conviction that the theory of capitalism, if correctly applied, should always create full employment in the long run. He states, "The manufacturer who can have recourse to a machine which shall lower the cost of production of his commodity would enjoy a particular advantage if he could continue to charge the same price for his goods, but he would be obligated to lower the price, or capital would flow to his competitors until his profits had sunk to the general level. Thus, then, the public does benefit by machinery." Section 8, Part 8, Theories of Value and Behavior. Underlying the assumptions of human behavior associated with capitalist philosophy are social class relationships, coupled with a metaphysical market logic where everything will work out just fine if certain values and a general selfish perspective is taken by the players of the market game, along with little to no restriction of the market itself. As an aside, nowhere in the writings of any economic theorist in favor of free market capitalism is the actual structure and process of production and distribution discussed. There is an explicit disconnect between industry, which is related to technical and scientific processes of true economic unfolding, and business, which pertains to codified market dynamics and the pursuit of profit. This kind of disconnect can also be found in dominant theories of value and human behavior, which inevitably serve to justify the institution of capitalism. The labor theory of value, made popular by Locke, Smith, and Ricardo, is a generalized proposal stating that the value of a commodity is related to the labor needed to produce or obtain that commodity. There are many levels of ambiguity here, and there have been many historical objections, including with respect to how to factor in natural resources and working investment capital. The growth of capital goods in the 20th and 21st centuries, such as machine automation of labor, presents challenges to this rather simplistic theory. After a certain point, the labor value inherent in these production machines, which are exponentially becoming more advanced and continually diminishing the need for human effort in production, presents an ever-diluted transfer of value in this context. So capital goods have become labor, so to speak. This ambiguity extends also to competing theories of value postulated by economists, including most notably the utility theory of value, which takes what could be called the market perspective, meaning that value is not derived from labor, but by the purpose or utility as perceived by the consumer. The consumer's perception of utility is based around how well they think a product or service will increase their happiness or reduce their suffering. Underlying these ideas of human behavior are traditionalized assumptions such as every person has some unsatisfied desires which he believes that additional wealth would gratify. Today, the dominant and largely accepted microeconomic perspective is that all human behavior is reducible to rational, strategic attempts to maximize either profit or gain and to avoid pain or loss. These utilitarian theories are in many ways both a psychological theory of how people behave and an ethical theory of how they ought to behave, arguably supporting a retroactive logic that often puts market theory before human behavioral reality, conforming the latter to the former. In reality, when the utilitarian perspective is fully considered, two serious problems emerge. The first is that there is no empirical means of confirming the intensity of one individual's sense of pleasure or pain with those of another individual. The entire life experience of a person compared to another person might find some very basic common ground with respect to their personal conditioning to pleasure and pain responses, but seldom will any parallel concordance be found in any detail. The second problem is the short-sighted nature of the assumed emotional reaction. Human beings have historically expressed the rational interest to suffer in the present in order to gain or hope to gain in the future. Altruism, which has undergone extensive philosophical debate, might very well be rooted in forms of pleasure obtained by the selfless, painful acts for the benefit of others. However, our intensely competitive economic system has generated and reinforced a mentality where short-term gain is sought after, often at the true expense of long-term suffering. Yet, in abstraction, utilitarianism also offers a bizarre kind of equalizer, since it can be identified with the perspective of mutual exchange, and hence a way to see capitalism as a system of social harmony rather than of warfare. In other words, all exchanges become seen as mutually beneficial to everyone in a narrow, absurdly abstract, generalized logic, because everyone chooses to take part in the exchanges that they make, as if no party ever has an unfair advantage over another party in any exchange or series of exchanges, and as if no one is ever in a situation where they have to take part in an unfair exchange in order to meet their immediate survival needs.